Welcome. In place of an introduction to this talk, I'd like to let folks know that around the halfway point, there's going to be a drastic pivot to talking about ongoing crises in mental health in a personal way, and I'll be vulnerable in a way that not many speakers tend to be. So if that's not something you're comfortable with, there's a talk next door on open telemetry that should be great. Michael Kehoe is giving a talk on how to get started with eBPF later today, and the Pixie project is a neat implementation of eBPF. See Daniel and Robert talk later this afternoon. So, how can you know more about your applications and systems? What tools are available? When would you use them and how? Let's say it's 9:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. You're getting coffee and see a message from a director of information security that there's a suspected security issue with an application running in prod. And nobody who was here when it was written still works here. You're now on the hook for figuring out whether it's vulnerable, whether it's being exploited, and what might be done about it if either of those things is the case. Scenario 2, a word from above says you need to attest that an auditing application provided by a vendor is behaving in an acceptable way. The vendor says it requires a root privilege to install and to run, and more importantly, they can't tell you how it behaves because it's running a combination of profiles provided by the vendor and profiles created in-house to tell you that your applications and infrastructure are complying with policy. So there's maybe thousands of lines of code developed in-house for many different needs that you need to know about. Not really a way to predict what syscalls those are performing, what files they're accessing, and things like that. Let's say you've solved both of these issues to the temporary satisfaction of everybody involved, and now you want to set something up to profile those applications on an ongoing basis and alert when the behavior changes significantly. Well, there are some commercial tools available to perform some of this work and some pre-built stuff out there that is getting better all the time. Until fairly recently, what I found when looking was that things didn't do very much to show you what's happening underneath the hood. So this is something of an issue from a security perspective and a performance perspective. So let's take a look at how you might use profiling tools to explore and instrument this stuff and come up with ways to be aware of the current behavior and to be aware of the changes when they occur. So when it comes to describing the state of the tracing ecosystem, I'm not sure that there's anything better than a series of blog posts that Julia Evans has written about it. Her zines on the tracing ecosystem really are better than anything I've encountered since maybe Evie's book and some of the Linux programming books way back when. When I started thinking about this problem last year, I was trying to think, what's out there? What can I do to say, what is this application doing? And this was a little bit pre-Log4j. And I wrote up some content around answering some scenarios for sysadvent last year. There's really no substitute for using tools to discover these things about your own problem sets. And I'm gonna pull up some information here if I can figure out how to get, okay. All right, so this is output from S-tracing and following execution of a little COBOL application. Let's say that's our legacy application that nobody knows about, we need to figure things out about. And a inspect profile. So when you run strace, did I include the command in there? I didn't. Oh, there we go. All right. So we've got the third-party auditing tool. We're executing the profile that's developed in-house, and we've got all of the syscalls that are related to it in the initial process. Then we've got forks. I don't know, if you've ever profiled an application on a Linux system, you might be used to seeing this kind of output. So I'm gonna skip ahead here and say that through using tools like this, you can say, what files is it that this thing is accessing when it's doing its work? So you now know, if you look at the behavior of the profile as it's coded, you've reviewed the code to know we're doing things that we intend to do, they're good, this should be happening in our environment. And we know that this version of the tool, Sync Auditor in this case, needs access to certain things on the system to run. You can know from profiling, grepping out the files that's being accessed, you can build a profile of the behavior in terms of what things does this access. And so when your security department comes and says, hey, we want to know that this is behaving the way that we expect it to, and we want to know how can we ensure that in the future, a software update by the vendor, that we know when the application behaves differently based on a software update by the vendor. So in many ways, strace and other tools behave kind of the same way. You're looking down below the command line, below what's being run to see what's being accessed. So this is me doing an strace specifically looking for file calls. You could do the same thing, look for network resources, and I know that that's going to come up in one of the later eBPF talks. You can look at just syscalls themselves. What all syscalls does this thing do? And you can build a profile to say, here's what the application behaves like when it's in its known good state. And you can use that profile to report on differences. So depending on your environment, you might need it to behave exactly the same every single way, or you might need it not to change and to alert on that and do something different, request a new exception, validate that the behavior is good, however, whatever your need is. Once you know what the application is doing, then you can, kick it out to Splunk, say, when this list of things that gets accessed, when I trace the behavior of this thing in my development environment, this is what it should look like, and I want to know when it changes. And so we'll get to it in just a second. But with strace, you might know that's something that you need to run every single time. It's not particularly good at being run in production because of the resource overhead, and you don't really want to be setting up like low-level debug tracing on every single thing when you have that kind of a performance hit in production. So taking that profiling and monitoring from dev to prod isn't maybe the best thing to do with strace. So that's where eBPF comes in. In my experimentation, I've found that eBPF is fantastic for point-in-time snapshots of the system, and that it's well developed towards streaming events based on queries like, show me how many new processors are being forked on the system, or tell me about interesting aspects of my HTTP traffic. How many MD flush requests are we seeing right now? But I think that there are some things left to be desired with eBPF's ability to trace in the same way that you can with strace. You can attach to a running process with eBPF pretty easily, but following the process from invocation to close, or invocation and seeing what's happening while it's running, is following forks and all that is a little bit more challenging with eBPF in the current state as far as I've seen so far. And I'll admit, I left out a lot of the material that I have written about eBPF in this presentation because I think that some of the other presenters are going to do a much better job than I will. I'm a learner and more of a hobbyist, and I can't really talk about what I do in my day job up on stage. So I'm going to take advantage of the time to do something else a little bit later on. Anyway, I do think there's something specific that eBPF is good at, like I said, the follow fork tracing. And in all the experimentation that I've done with the tooling, when it comes to file access stuff specifically, there's a lot to be desired. bpftrace truncates the command line, truncates arguments and stuff down to a certain number of characters. And I think it's a limit of the printf functionality within it. And I haven't yet been able to find how I can tweak the code to address that or give full output, which is pretty important from an auditing perspective. It is quite good, as you'll see in some of the other presentations, at looking at HTTP traffic and monitoring syscalls in an ongoing way. So I touched on this a little bit earlier. I'm going to abbreviate it here. How? Determine your target. Whatever the profiling tool that you use is, earlier on in the pipeline, whether it's local laptop, in dev, in the pipeline, you can add tracing commands to your work to say, here's what it looks like, build that baseline, and then using whatever tooling you have available to you, surface deviance. In the examples that I have, and when I give the notes, there's a link to the sysadvent blog post that has the code examples on how I did what I did. But it can be as simple as grep for the differences or awk out the data that doesn't matter, just give you what you need, or give it to Splunk or Prometheus or whatever your existing tool set is that you use for alerting and monitoring. So now I'm going to be taking that pivot that I talked about earlier. This is going to involve some talk about a different sort of vulnerability response. And if anyone isn't comfortable hearing about mental health topics, I'm going to give you an opportunity to leave. All right. First, thank you to Heidi and Mohit for being supportive of my request to use some of this talk time to discuss vulnerability, compassion, and self-care. And thanks to all of you for sticking around. I'd like to start by asking for folks to take a moment to show yourselves some compassion. You've come here during difficult times. There's a great deal of stress out there and not enough opportunities to take a long moment to breathe and remember that we're all humans with limited perspective and time. In between submitting this talk proposal and preparing the material for the presentation, a couple things happened. On a global scale, we watched the invasion of a sovereign nation by one of the world's greatest powers. And I know for folks in my age bracket, that might bring back some trauma about other similar situations that we faced in the past. After having avoided it for most of the pandemic, I contracted COVID through my child's school. And since recovering in January, I've been experiencing some long-term reduction in my ability to taste, and what had been manageable ADHD symptoms have become pretty challenging to deal with. And so as a result of that, I've found that my emotional state, my triggers for things like depression, have been a little bit easier to hit. there's no avoiding trauma in our lives and in our jobs. To me, over the past 12 years, the emergence of DevOps with the focus on culture, measurement, and sharing has kept me hopeful that our work lives can be improved from this standpoint. And the work of Dr. Decker, John Allspaw, and the folks I've watched go through the Lund program have made me hopeful that collectively we can spur improvement in healthy work lives and lead healthier lives overall. Now, I feel like over the past 2 years, it's been particularly challenging to return to basics, right? So the content of the presentation, the technical side, was about looking at low-level things happening on computer systems and using that to know the state of our environment and to use that to say, when has something changed? Then you can decide what to do about it. We don't have tools like that for our emotions or the stressors in everyday life. But knowing that there are a bunch of people working to make lives, that there are a bunch of people working to make our work lives more manageable. How are we doing, team? Let's check in. What's going on with Jill? Let's give her an opportunity for some downtime, right? These sorts of things make it okay for us to be human in our work and not just resources to be leveraged in the ways of Taylor's and classical management theory. In and outside of work, there's really no way to tell when you're going to be required to handle stress beyond the level of what you believe you're capable of dealing with. And all the stress that we experience needs to be processed and managed, or else our systems break down. For me, in what was previously the darkest time in my life, about 10, 12 years ago, I was working as a caseworker at a community mental health agency and helped people get through serious crisis on a regular basis. Watching people go through that and helping them go through that as my daily work. You know, I would train them on computers, help folks to get jobs, and also be part of peer counseling sessions regularly. Go out, help people to the hospital. And as a result of the things that I saw and me not knowing how to process those, even though I had, developed a mindfulness practice for stress reduction, started self-monitoring my emotions and figuring out ways to regulate them, I went through my own periods of crisis. For me, part of my depression symptoms from a pretty early age has been suicidal ideation, and not in a way that I feel the need to do anything about it. A friend of mine said, a big part of that, the idea of, I'm depressed or I'm out of true to who I am, and you start acting in ways that that you normally wouldn't, is, he called it overthinking your options, right? Overthinking your options from a personal standpoint. And to me, I'd always been able to say, oh yeah, my brain is saying, this is, terrible, what if I... But I was always able to say that option is not on the table. And when it comes to finding a way through periods in crisis, whether it's that kind of negative emotional feedback loop or a rough on-call shift involving loss of time and money at a large company, there are a few things that I know through my own experience that I can say for certain will be able to help most folks. It can get better. I'm saying that from a place of privilege, but my privilege isn't comprehensive, right? I haven't always had money. I've worked with people who've been in horrible situations. And through getting through it, and through learning about yourself, establishing emotional baselines, learning about what your triggers are, figuring out how to get past it, it's possible to recover from things that might seem insurmountable. Right? We see TED Talks about getting through alcoholism and things like that. Like it's possible. And there are ways that you can help if you have the capacity to. I imagine most of the folks in here have developed skills in incident response. Some of the things that you do there are transferable to other situations as well. Don't try to do it all at once, right? You're working a production incident at work. If you try and look at the problem and boil the ocean right away, if you don't take time to examine what's going on and break things down to the point where units of work are manageable, it takes longer. Don't try and do it all yourself. Ask for help. Even if the people that you know in your own life, you don't know how to ask for help from them, there are places that you can go. You can ask me, right? I'm on Twitter. Occasionally, my DMs are open. Hang up Slack, I'm in this Slack. And I'd be happy to talk with you. And don't forget to check that the fundamental prerequisites for not being in crisis are in place, right? Have you hydrated? Taken some time for yourself. I'm not particularly fond of it myself, but exercise works pretty well. And I'm leaving that typo in there because I think I need the silliness right now. And that's it. I hope for better things for all of us every year for the rest of our lives. Thanks.